Hey folks, it's Ardwulf. Welcome. Today we're going to do something a little different, and that is a game review. I've never really done a quote-unquote review on this channel. We will see how this video develops. Certainly there will be room for improvement, so if you have any suggestions, please leave them in the comments below. Today's target is Stellar Horizons, 2020 release from Compass Games and designer Andrew Rader. I'm not going to really go that heavily into the system mechanics. I'm going to cover them very broadly since this is not an instructional video, but we will cover the highlights and the pros and cons, and we will land on a conclusion without forcing you to sit through a lengthy 30-plus minute video. So, Stellar Horizons is not a war game. The game does show some war game DNA. The designer has some familiarity, certainly with World in Flames, where he has design credits, and has mentioned Empires in Arms as well. So, but still, Stellar Horizons not a war game. Now, I will start off with, or continue with, it is a retail price of $149 US, which is a relatively high price. It is at this very moment on sale from Compass Games for $129 US. So if you're considering picking it up, you might want to push the button while that price is still live. You may be able to get it for less from other online retailers. I will tell you that there is an enormous quantity, which I'm not really going to be able to show off here. There is an enormous quantity of stuff in that box. It is super big. It is super heavy. As you've seen in the unboxing video, watch the unboxing video if you want to see all the contents, but there's a lot of stuff. This is more than twice as wide and about half again as deep as your standard wargame box, including from Compass. There's a lot here. It's a high price tag, but there's a lot to it, and there's a lot to the game as well. So what is Stellar Horizons? It is a space exploration game that covers our solar system out to Alpha Centauri. The gameplay starts in yearly turns. It starts in 2030, so it's just around the corner, and it ends randomly at some point between 2145 and 2169. So turns are 1 year turns, but every decade there is an economic phase where you do things like get income and produce commodities, and you buy technology, make policy changes. The game is a space travel game, but it also includes exploration, trade, technological development, and maybe even an interstellar war. We'll talk about that in a minute. According to the rulebook, the full campaign takes 8 hours for experienced players. I think that's a little bit optimistic. But it's not like a 40 or 50 hour game either. I would say it's comparable to Twilight Imperium in this regard. It seems like it will take somewhere between 8 and 16 hours to play through a whole campaign. Depending on player experience level, it will definitely move faster with experienced players. And we didn't play a full campaign. We played 2 shorter games of it. There are also scenarios that do have a shorter play time, but none of the scenarios is really a quick playing scenario. And none of them, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes as well, none of them is really like an advanced start scenario either. They're all just different starts. So the game mechanics. Game mechanics are not Euro mechanics, and they're quite deep. You can see the wargame roots in the design, and here's why I say that, because they're simulationist mechanics, even though they're relatively simple and straightforward, rather than Euro mechanics that don't have any connection to the things that they're trying to simulate. The mechanics, like I said, are not particularly complicated, but they are simulationist, which is a style of game that I like, so that's cool by me. The game uses D10s, mostly as percentile dice, but it also uses individual D10s for exploration and a few other things. Every time you move a spacecraft, and spacecraft can be launch vehicles, they can be crewed vehicles, they can be robotic explorers, you have to roll for engine failure, which starts at a 5% chance. So if you roll less than 5%, the ship blows up and you lose everything that was on it. That percentage can go down based on some of the special abilities for some of the factions and by technology. But you can also do multiple move segments inside a given move. So you can move like from Earth all the way out to, approaching Mars in one move, even though that's more than one step on the tiles. That did confuse us a little bit. So for exploration, what you're trying to do is you're trying to roll a D10 under your ship's exploration rating plus the exploration rating of the world that you're exploring. If you roll under that, then you get to draw a technology chit from a cup. There are 3 different tech types: physics, engineering, and biology. And these are arranged on a tech tree that'll be familiar to players of Space 4X video games, for example. After you explore, you have to make a malfunction roll if it's a robotic ship, or a recall roll if it's a crewed vehicle. Those percentages start at 30% and 50% respectively, but they can all be modified by technology. You can do what's called depleting the planet if you draw a chit of a certain value, and what value depends on whether it's a crewed vehicle or a robotic explorer. That causes the exploration value of the planet to go down, but it also lets you draw a world card, which gives special statuses to the world, and it also lets you check for signs of life, and if you find signs of life, you get victory points. Every decade, like I said, there's an economic phase where you get income and do diplomacy and produce resources and buy technology, and space policy is also built into the game. That works similarly, except that you get a space policy change for free every decade. So you're going to have a certain amount of those that you can do throughout the course of the game. There are essentially 4 commodities of the game: ore, fuel, supplies, and money. Ships are built with ore, fuel, and supplies, but at the beginning of the game, you're going to have to build everything on Earth, and you're just going to buy those commodities with money, which makes kind of the early game very money-focused. And one of the goals that you're going to have, and this will take decades of play in the game, is to get production off of Earth, so you could produce ore and fuel and supplies at, say, Mars or in the asteroid belt or wherever, instead of having to buy it all with money on Earth. And then that frees up your money to do other things, like buy the political chits and do other stuff like that. Like I said, there is a combat system. It's pretty straightforward, but I kind of like it. There's a nice touch where you have to roll to search to even find an opposing ships, because space is big, big, big. If the other side's successful, the result of the search roll will determine the tactics points for each side, and then each side can spend those, or at least the side with more can spend those to increase damage or call shots to specific targeted ships or targets, or even completely cancel the combat. Then when you decide, okay, we're going to fight now, you roll the d10, you put all the combat values on top of that number, and then you look up the result on a table to determine how much damage you did, and then you alternate back and forth dealing those points of damage. It's pretty straightforward. It isn't something that you're necessarily going to see a ton of between players in a given game, but later on in the game you can spawn NPC space pirates, so there are things to shoot at besides other players as well. So let's talk about the cons first. I always like to get the cons out of the way first, and there are some. So one thing that is, maybe a con and maybe not, is that it's super, super footprint hungry. There's a lot of stuff in this box. The fact that the board is made of individual tiles that you can kind of lay out wherever you want does let you arrange the layout to fit your space. But I can tell you that on this 2 by 6 foot table back here, that's more than 6 feet actually, we were very hard pressed to get everything on that table. Now, some of the scenarios tell you to set up only part of the solar system, but this also limits your exploration options once the world that you have laid out eventually deplete. So none of the scenarios seem quite fully baked in comparison to the campaign. One other thing that we ran into immediately is the structure of the rulebook. It is partly organized by topic at the beginning, and then the bulk of the rulebook shifts to being a procedural rulebook. Now, procedural rulebooks are I like procedural rulebooks. They work well with my way of learning games, which is by skimming the rules and then setting everything up and pushing pieces around and looking stuff up as I go. And a lot of the rulebook is written exactly this way, but there are a number of things, like the way world cards work, that are located in the initial segment before the rules get to the procedural parts. And I found that distracting. And those parts are not mentioned later in the book. The included rule summaries, they look like rule summaries, but in fact, they just reprint verbatim the procedural sections of the rules. They're nice to have, but as I mentioned, that those sections leave things out. So I feel like this was a significant missed opportunity, particularly for a game this size. Going through the examples of play, if you have difficulty with the rules, and there are examples of play, I'm happy to report, is strongly recommended. It's not as exhaustive an example of play as I would like to see, but it's there and it is helpful. Similarly, the player aid cards are, shall we say, not all they could be. They are 11 by 17 folding panels. They waste one of those 4 panels on a pretty cover. The inside has a setup chart on all 7 cards, which is not super useful. And the only useful thing on the entire card are the icon key and the heliocentric transfer time chart and the asteroid harvest table. So there's a lot of missed space there that could have been used for things that are more useful, like summaries of the different kinds of robotic explorers, for example, all of which behave differently. So additionally, the amount of displays for tracking tech and policy are really sturdy and they're attractive, but the print on them is entirely too small. These aspects of the game probably could have been handled better with cards, although I can certainly understand why decks of cards might be an expensive addition to the printing costs of a game that's already really expensive, and therefore whoever was in charge did not want to go with that option. That's understandable, but the print is really small. When you start playing Stellar Horizons, be prepared that it's a very slow roll start. It will take a minimum of 2 or 3 decades before any faction can establish a serious presence off of Earth, and significant parts of the game, like trade and diplomacy and conflict, don't fully engage until that happens. If you're playing with less than all 7 factions, you should limit them to North America, Russia, China, and Asia. Those are the factions that start with crewed vehicles and the ability to build them, although only North America in the campaign game can actually go beyond the Earth-Moon system at start and can't get past Earth orbit. Now, I don't mind the slow-moving start so much. This lets you build your space program literally from the ground up. But it also would have been nice to have seen a developed start scenario included that starts around, say, 2070, so that all the factions have established a manned foothold in space, and there you could start from there without the initial building. It would be nice to have that option. In terms of scenario selection, it would also have been nice to have seen a small, short tutorial scenario to teach you the basics of moving and exploring and fighting, and that's not there either. So the scenario selection is another quibble that I would have. However, with all that griping out of the way, there is a lot to like about Stellar Horizons. Barring the issues with the usefulness of some of the play aids that I mentioned, the component quality is really, really high. Again, check out the unboxing video if you want to see the details of all that stuff. The tiles and the counters are very thick. They're all mounted, and the mounted tech board is very sturdy. There are some goofs on a few of the counters, but there are replacement counters that are included in the box. The extra goodies like the extra rule book and the multiple copies of the play aids and the rule summaries are very welcome, even if they and the player aids are not quite what they could be. I like that the individual mechanics are relatively simple, but as with any deep game, their interactions become complex. That's something I look for in games. I think the replay value of this is really, really high. It's not necessarily something you're going to be able to play like every week unless it's going to become your thing and this is what you're going to play. Just because it's so big, the setup does take a while. But the replay value is very high. The game has a tremendous scope. You have over a century of solar system development all the way clear out to Alpha Centauri. And it's really neat to see your own space presence evolve over time. I personally didn't really want to stop playing even after our time ran out. Now, Stellar Horizons is broadly comparable to a number of other games that I'm familiar with and have talked about before, so I will mention that. The obvious comparison would be with Phil Eklund's High Frontier, which has very similar scope, but Stellar Horizons has far less Byzantine mechanics, and it is also, unlike some versions of High Frontier, it is also a complete game in one box. You're not getting only parts of the game. It's also comparable to GMT's Space Corp, but it has simulationist mechanics instead of gamist Euro mechanics. I prefer those kinds of mechanics. Space Corp does cover early interstellar exploration, whereas Stellar Horizons only touches on the very beginning of that era. But also, obviously, Space Corp has a much, much shorter playtime and requires more table space than you probably think it does, but it's not anything remotely close to the amount of table space that Stellar Horizons consumes. I also found myself comparing it to Twilight Imperium, which has similarly epic scope and footprint for that matter. Stellar Horizons is much more of a sandbox, is much more of an exploration and development game with combat, whereas TI is a game about interstellar conflict that has a trivial exploration element and much less emphasis on development elements. Stellar Horizons does push all of the 4X buttons, while Twilight Imperium does not, or doesn't push them in a satisfactory way. I love Twilight Imperium. I think it's a fantastic game. I do not believe it to be a 4X game because there are X's missing. Maybe it's a 2 or 3X game. Another existing game that sort of exists in a similar space, or at least you might think so, is GMT's Space Empires 4X, which is another game that I like a great deal. Stellar Horizons has a very different scope than Space Empires. Space Empires is an interstellar game. It is a war game, and while Stellar Horizons has some war game influences that I think you'll see if you look at the game, Space Empires is a war game, and not just because combat's just a small part of Stellar Horizons. In Space Empires, fighting inevitably happens, and happens sooner rather than later, whereas in Stellar Horizons, you might see it and you might not. Now, compared to these three games, I hands down prefer Stellar Horizons to High Frontier. I think it is a better game. I think it is a better designed game. I like it better than Space Corp, but that's more of a taste issue than it is a statement about how good a game it is. Space Corp is just quite a different kind of game. And the same thing applies to Space Empires 4X. They are notionally similar when you look at the boxes before you investigate either game, but in fact, they're very different. Now, in terms of how much I like it, I kind of think it's kind of neck and neck now with Twilight Imperium, which again is a game I like a lot. And I think I like it as much as I do because of the real world kind of near future grounding rather than sort of the high space opera that you get with Twilight Imperium. So in summation, I'm inventing my own words now. In summation, I'm not going to give a numerical rating to Stellar Horizons because I think that's kind of worthless. Everybody's going to have their own numerical scale and everybody's going to have different criteria. So I think thumbs up is what I give it. I liked it a lot. I would like to play it again. I would like to set aside a good chunk of space and time and with about 5 people to really dig into the full campaign and play it to completion. I liked it a great deal. If you want to check it out, I will include a link to the Compass Games website for the game in the video description. So if you've enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the bell notification icon to get notifications when new videos are released. Be sure to leave any questions or comments below. And if you'd like to support the channel, there is a Patreon link in the video description. Until next time, happy gaming.